Hello, hello. Speakers are on. Everybody hear me okay?
Oh, yeah. Everybody's here for the Raising Venture Capital Tips, is that right? Keith, we were expecting a bigger crowd.
Yeah, well, but it's all the smart people who are here.
Yeah.
So I guess we just start on our own?
Yeah.
Nobody's going to, no music, no?
I should have had John come up here.
All right. Okay, well, welcome to the How to Raise Capital fireside chat. We'll introduce ourselves. Actually, I'll let you start, Chris.
Hello. Chris Costello. They wouldn't give us a fire inside of here for obvious reasons, so pretend that this is a fireside chat. I grew up in Olathe, went to the University of Kansas, lived here my entire life. I've been lucky enough to start two different companies. One, a revenue-backed company, which we'll talk about, and the second, a venture-backed company, which we're going to talk a lot about today. Was lucky enough to sell the revenue-backed company to my business partners, and then in 2022, we sold the venture-backed company Bloom to Morgan Stanley. Of late, I run a boutique wealth management firm, mainly for friends, people I like and love, colleagues, professional acquaintances here in town.
I am Keith Harrington. I am co-founder of Novel Capital, also here in Kansas City. I also grew up in Olathe. I've actually known Chris since we were in junior high. His dad coached me in basketball, which I feel bad for his dad.
A couple short Irish guys here.
I was neither good nor fast nor tall. I also went to the University of Kansas, ended up graduating from Park University with a degree in finance, an MBA from Indiana University. I for a time in my career, was a VC for about 9 years. And during that experience, I realized that VC isn't for everybody. And I decided that what I really wanted to do was build something that would be able to help more entrepreneurs than I could as a venture capitalist. So about 7 years ago, my co-founder and I, Carlos Santacara, launched our first fund doing revenue-based financing. Learned a lot, went really well. So we ended up launching a fintech business that now does basically automated credit decisioning for early stage B2B SaaS businesses. We've raised $150 million, deployed about 90 to 125 companies around the country. And that's my sales pitch. So I think today what we really want to do is share the benefit of Chris's experience. And I might pepper in a couple of little notes along the way. But we've both raised a lot of capital. Chris has had a really interesting career in that, like he said, he's raised capital for a fintech startup, but he's also built a company that didn't raise capital. And so he has a really unique perspective on when, why, and how to raise capital, when it makes good sense to do so. And I think that's the thing that we really want to get across today. So looking forward to digging into that. But I think one of the things that Chris always hammers on and hammers home when we talk is there's one critical lesson that he wants to share and should share before we start talking. So go ahead.
Well, it's kind of like our disclaimer, maybe, Keith. You know, one of the things I tell entrepreneurs all the time is you have to have a very highly functioning filter, because you're going to get advice as an entrepreneur that's going to come from a wife, a spouse, friends, board of directors, potentially investors. Anybody you meet is going to give you advice. Heck, we're giving you advice today. And I think that one of the qualities that an entrepreneur needs to possess is a filter to be able to discern what is actually actionable advice. And only you as the founder, potential founder of a business, are going to know that. I don't know that I can share with you any nuggets on how this filter works. I think just knowing that you need to have one and be aware that you are going to get a variety of different points of advice from all over the map, and know that you have to filter and decide what's actionable. So that's our disclaimer. It is advice from Keith and I. It may not necessarily be right for you. So keep that in mind as we have this chat today.
Everybody should take advice from your wife, though.
Always. Yes. My wife is here today, so she's keeping tabs.
So, Chris, let's start talking through your experience. When you and I have dug into this topic in the past, I'm always really fascinated by how you decided to build two businesses. So talk us through the differences between building a company with venture capital, which I think is probably what everybody here wants to hear about. Raise your hand if you're interested in learning how to raise venture capital. Okay. And what it's like to build a business without.
Yeah, I have done both. The first business was without venture capital, and what I mean by that is we basically didn't grow until we had the revenue in the business and the profits in the business to fund further growth. I had a question from a young entrepreneur the other day, and he was asking me when's the right time to hire more people, and he was not headed down the path of raising capital. And I said, well, it's very easy, and once you have the money in the company to do that, that's when you hire your next employee. The second company we started was venture-backed. It was a totally different business model. We bootstrapped it for several years before we came to the conclusion that we needed outside capital. As somebody who's done both, and I know you're here to hear about raising venture capital, between the two that I've done, and again, this is my opinion, if you can get away with raising a business or building a business without having to get outside capital, that oftentimes can be the preferable way. Revenue-based funding, meaning that you don't grow the business and invest in the business until you have the money, is the least dilutive. Revenue is the cheapest form of financing, we like to say. You don't have to give away control or equity to outside people. Yes, it's probably a slower path to growth, but there's benefits there. With the venture-backed business, our second business that we got going in 2013, that was something that we know we needed speed to the market. It was a new idea. It was a highly competitive space at the time, and we did not have the luxury of time on our side to build this business. And we were trying to build something very, very big. In my early days, I thought this was something that could be a massive, massive business. Didn't turn out to be quite that big, but in the beginning, we knew we were trying to race. We knew we were in a competitive space, and that was a big reason why we chose to raise capital that second time.
I think that's a really important point, is to really have a very solid thesis about why you want to raise outside capital, whether it's venture capital, in which case you need to be focused on speed to market, hyper growth kind of market opportunities, or some other kind of capital, debt capital, whatever, that might be a little bit more forgiving in terms of growth rates. But that's something that whenever I talk to entrepreneurs, that's one of the first things that I say when they say, how do you raise venture capital? My first answer is, well, how do you know you need to? Mm-hmm. Let's just talk through what it is you have and whether venture capital is even right for your business. Because we all know the numbers, right? Less than 1% of entrepreneurs will raise venture capital, and even a smaller number of those are going to get to the outcome that they're trying to achieve. And some number of those probably should have either just gone bootstrapped or figured out another way to build the business. Venture capital is absolutely a great fit for some businesses, and it can be an absolute killer for others. So Chris,
your point about you said a moment ago, fewer than 1% of all startups are actually able to raise venture capital. If you take out Silicon Valley and New York, now we're talking like teeny tiny fractions of 1%. In Kansas City, when we raised our first round in 2015, it was kind of interesting, big news at the time. I happen to be joined here today. John Thompson is here, the founder and CEO of Payet. He's another successful entrepreneur in Kansas City that was successful in raising venture capital. But there's not, probably name on one hand 10 years ago the companies that had been successful at raising. So know that if you are headed down that path, it is very, very difficult. You're in know what the odds are, and know that you're from Kansas City, and know that you're going to have to get on an airplane or get in a car. You can't just look within Kansas City to raise capital. One of the things that gave me the benefit of being able to sit up here on stage today and share some of these lessons with you is that I jokingly refer to myself as a member of the 100 Club. So when we raised our 2 rounds of capital, I had made over 130 pitches to professional VCs to try and raise money. So it takes a lot. The benefit is I learned a lot in doing that, and hope to share some of those tips with you today.
So let's talk about that process. In 2013, you and your co-founders decided to launch Blooom, and you knew you needed capital to execute quickly, build the company as fast as you could, because as you said, at the time there were a bunch of players in the market, and it was a land grab. Tell us about the process. How did you even get started? Because in 2013, the venture ecosystem in Kansas City was nascent. It was pretty, well, it was just starting to get kicked off again.
I think, yeah, because I think Launch KC, we won a Launch KC grant in 2015. That may have been one of the first years they were even doing that. So myself and my two co-founders had this idea to build a algorithmic-based app that could manage anyone's 401k, no matter where they worked or no matter where their 401k was held, all done through technology and automation. So we're in the financial services space, a space that I've been in my entire life, but it obviously a very highly regulated and very competitive space. And so we had an idea that when we were starting this company and where we were trying to take it to, that we were probably going to need capital. Luckily, at the time, myself and my two co-founders were in a position where we could bootstrap the company for the first maybe 2 years or so. It did require, a chunk of capital from our pocketbooks into the company. And we got to a point where, kind of maybe to drill down to the answer of when the time was right to raise, where we had a product in the market. We had proved product market fit. We were starting to gain a teeny tiny bit of fraction. Our pricing model was very, very low. We charged basically about the same as Netflix does each month to professionally manage your 401k. And so we needed scale. Obviously, somebody paying $120 a year, our revenue model was contingent upon us having eventually hundreds of thousands, if not millions of clients. And so we knew we needed to move fast at that point. And quite honestly, myself and the two co-founders were tired, getting a little long in the tooth of writing checks to the business each month. And so I think that was the impetus behind when we decided to actually go out and raise. We were fortunate in that in 2014 we signed up to do several pitch competitions, and I do love public speaking, but I made it my mission to become really, really good at presenting. I read a book called The Presenting Secrets of Steve Jobs. Anybody that's ever going to sell or raise money should read this. It's phenomenal. Anybody that can remember Steve Jobs' wonderful presentations, some of the early iPhone releases, how good of a job he used to do. And so I tried to do and mimic everything that he did when it came to presentations. And so we were accepted to present in New York at a very big financial technology conference called Finovate in the fall of 2014, and out of 70 companies, we were one of the winners of the Best of Show, and in that audience were 1,500 executives and VCs and members of the media, and so luckily we actually got on the map fairly early. It was a very big turning point for the company. We got on the map with a lot of venture capital firms, so we actually, for the first 8 months after that conference, spent a lot of time actually telling the VCs who were calling us that we weren't ready to raise yet, but when we finally decided we needed the outside capital, we had a list of venture capital firms to go to. I'm proud to say that of the 130 pitches I made, I never once had to cold call or cold email anyone, because we started with those original investors. This is an important point. And every single time that investor told me no, I made sure to get 1 or 2 referrals of somebody else in their space. I understand this may not be appropriate for your fund or your style of investing, but I know other investors that are looking at looking for deal flow, need to see ideas. Can you help introduce me to 1 or 2 of those? And that worked every single time.
Chris, I want to jump in and just go a little bit deeper on something. So, first of all, fundraising from a position of strength is always the best possible way to go about it. So when an investor calls Chris and he says, we don't need the capital right now, but I'll sure let you know when we do, that's a great look. Mm-hmm. However, that's rare, I would say. That's incredibly rare. In most cases, an entrepreneur is starting a business and has to go out and find venture capitalists or angel investors. And it's exceedingly difficult because most entrepreneurs simply do not have access to those kinds of people. They do not have access to those networks. And that's one of the things that's really hard that's one of the biggest things that entrepreneurs struggle with, I think. How do you think about, what's the advice you would give to early stage entrepreneurs who are trying to figure out, how do I even get in the same room with these people? How do I even have a chance to have a conversation? Because if I can't have a conversation, I can't pitch them.
Fair point. Yeah. Well, I think it just starts with one. I mean, you're here today. You're networking. You're probably meeting some people. You might be meeting investors today. It starts with one conversation, even if it is a conversation here in the hallway, and you're speaking to an investor. Ask for an introduction. I like to think I'm a big student of human psychology, and one of the things in sales is when people say no to you, oftentimes most people have this desire. They've told you no, but they've got a desire to still help you in some way. And so I tried to take advantage of that. When someone told me no, I would play upon their desire, their natural human tendencies to want to still try and help. And usually they're good about asking, or usually they're good about offering one or two names in the space they may know that would be open to a phone call or an email from you. The other thing that I think is very important, and this may be the one thing that I would encourage you to remember the most from the things that we say today, is that you need to flip the script when it comes to meeting with investors. It's very hard to do this, but I hope if I can explain it, you'll see the benefits of this. You need to ask the investor as much as they're asking of you. Put them on the spot, interview them. Find out how they've helped other companies that are in your space. It's the same thing I used to tell young people when they go for a job interview. Anytime in my life when I've interviewed somebody and I get to the end of the interview and I ask that person, that candidate, do they have any questions for me? If that person says, nope, I think you've answered everything, they're immediately excluded, no chance of getting hired. This is an opportunity to put the investor, the venture capital investor, on the spot a little bit. And what happens is when you start asking them questions, all of a sudden you're sending them the message that you've got options, that you've got optionality, that you're not desperate that this guy or gal better write you a check. It subtly sends a message to them that you have other options in the space, which is huge because then people, another part of human psychology is they want what they think they can't have. And so you all of a sudden become more desirable. I did that every single time with investors, is I made sure to ask them questions. What questions would you ask? Well, in my opinion, generally a venture firm should be able to offer three key things. Obviously, one is the check, that's obvious. The second thing is a little bit of the been there, done that type help. So has the venture investor served in a company like yours, been on a board of a company like yours, helped a company like yours scale to the next level? That's what I mean when I say the been there, done that type experience. And the third thing is what type of introductions can they provide? Can they make introductions to other investors? Can they make introductions to other strategic investors, maybe companies that might have an interest in either investing or partnering with you in some type of go-to-market strategy? Those are the types of questions that you can be asking of that other investor, and you want to know the answers too. I mean, certainly you're looking for money, but ideally you want to find somebody who can write a check and be value added as well.
Yeah, and I might just add a couple of things to that point. You know, when you're out on the fundraising trail, you want to make sure that you have as many conversations as possible, but you really want to make sure that all your conversations are going to be fruitful. Not all of them are going to end up in a yes, but as Chris said, even a no can turn into a potential referral. And you'll get pushback from people who will say, well, if I get a referral from somebody who's saying they're not going to invest in my business, that's not a very warm or powerful referral. I disagree with that completely. I have taken many referrals, turned them into eventual investors, and it's just part of the process that we run at Novel. So I totally agree with that. The other thing that I would suggest at a very, very tactical level, and this was something that I sort of knew intuitively, but I didn't really action until I really had to. It's a sales process. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, raising money is just a sales process. It is about building a funnel, qualifying targets, and then running a sales process with really tight discipline. And if you can do that, then you've got a pretty good shot at getting the capital that you need. And along the way, learning the lessons that you need to learn in order to tailor your pitch for the kinds of investors that you want. But that process and system approach, in my opinion, is one of the most important differentiators between entrepreneurs who raise capital and entrepreneurs who don't. Access to investors is hard. It's really hard if you're not running a tight process.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the sales process because sometimes I think for whatever reason, sales gets a bad rap. If you are a technical founder and the thought of sales makes your skin crawl, you need to find a co-founder. Very few of us are going to start a company like Zuckerberg did all those years ago, where on its own it just goes viral. Okay, there's very few of those out there. You know, it's the Facebooks, it's the brand names we all know today. The rest of us that aren't starting the next Facebook, you got to get out there and sell it. You may invent or build the most incredible fill in the blank, whatever, but if the world does not know about it, it doesn't matter. So either get very, very comfortable with sales, or if you don't think you can get there, find a co-founder who can complement you there. There's a lot of technical people that start off on the journey and build wonderful apps, but they can't communicate it, or the thought of sales, bothers them. And plus, I think actually having a co-founder, startups are really freaking hard. I can't imagine having done it by myself. Like that would have sucked. It really would have. It's such a brutal grind. You need to have somebody that's got your back. I'm a big believer in co-founders.
Oh yeah, I mean, building a company is one of the most fundamentally hard things you can do. I think it's exceedingly difficult. So you talked about when an investor says no, you can still ask for referrals. But oftentimes, when an investor says no, they're not fully honest and transparent with you about why it is that they're saying no, right? You'll often get the, you're too early, keep us posted. All kinds of excuses for a no that are just really vague and not super helpful. You ran into that, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up too. Hearing no, or a derivative of no, which is like you said, come back to me when you have more traction. Come back to me when you got product market fit. Once your revenue's over X, come talk to me. And for a while, I didn't get that they were actually telling me no, but they were saying it in a nice way. Because really, if you put yourself in the shoes of the investor, they don't want to be the investor that passed on Facebook or Airbnb or Google, because there were a lot of people that passed on Airbnb. I mean, come on. Having people sleep in your guest bedroom, who would have ever thought that would have taken off? So there were plenty of investors that passed there, and they don't want to be known as the person that passed on investing in the next big thing. And so they kind of string you along so that if they hear that you've achieved some type of escape velocity in your startup, maybe they can come back around because they never really told you no. So when you hear one of those things, when your BS radar is going off and you're getting feedback and they're saying, come talk to me when X, or it sounds like they're just blowing you off, it is probably no, and B, you really need to press on finding out why they're saying no, okay? And you're probably going to hear one of two different things when you ask that question. You're going to hear a BS answer. You might need to ask again, tell me more. Ask another open-ended question. Why do you feel? Why do you think that? Why do you say that? Dig a little bit more, okay? It could still be BS, and it may be just because they don't know your space. The other thing, they might actually give you something actionable, and you need to be using your CEO founder filter that we talked about earlier to decide if that is the case. But they've told you no. You've got nothing to lose at this point, or some derivative of no. You've got nothing to lose at this point. Be sure to press them. Tell me why this is not something of interest. Ask, ask, ask. Listen, then decide if that's appropriate, actionable, or not. We definitely learned some things occasionally from investors that passed on Bloom, and it was stuff that made it into actual product design. So asking for the real reason.
So this just reminded me that a VC friend of mine once told me, if it's not a yes, it's a no, which is an extreme version of this conversation. Does that resonate with your experience?
Generally speaking, yeah. And we've talked about this, you and I, many times. Slow maybes are terrible. And, it's frustrating. I experienced all of this. This is why we're talking about it. Slow maybes are crippling for a startup founder who's trying to move very fast, likely on limited resources. You really don't have time to jack around with a bunch of people that give you fake answers. And so I would much rather somebody early on just say no, give me a chance to ask them why they're saying no, and move on down the road, versus which I did. You start to build up this huge pipeline. I remember going back into my co-founders after a pitch saying, this person's definitely going to invest. In fact, I even heard from some investor at one point that we were 100% in. Just keep in mind, they're not 100% in until the money is in, until the wire is in the bank, yes.
So let's talk about valuation. That's a fun topic that in the conversation with a VC or an angel investor, you're eventually going to get to the part where they say, so what valuation are you raising at? And there are a whole bunch of different ways to answer that question, and some of them are good and some of them are less good. But you've had some experience with that. Share what you think there.
Yeah, a very wise mentor of mine, Bo Fishback, here in Kansas City, some of you may know Bo, told me this very early on. Never, ever answer that question, period, full stop. When some investor asks you, these are discussions you certainly can have with people in your inner circle, your advisors, your mentors, your co-founders, but when an investor asks you that question, never, ever answer it. The way I would answer that question is I would simply say, well, we are expecting typical terms of Series A dilution. And normally speaking, and if you don't know what dilution means and you're going to raise venture capital, you have to know what this stuff means. My first business, as we talked about earlier, we did not raise venture capital. It wasn't until I was 40 years old in 2013 when we had the idea for Bloom that we decided to raise venture capital. I couldn't even spell venture capital barely at age 40, but I spent an entire year learning everything I freaking could about raising money, what all the terms meant. I made myself an expert, and that was 11 years ago. I know the resources are even better today. You can find everything you need online and on YouTube, so there's no excuse for you not knowing how this stuff is. There's old-fashioned books even that are written that if you wanted to read on this stuff. So, but back to your question, I would just simply say we're expecting typical Series A dilution on this first round, and then I would basically tell them, this is the amount of money we're raising. This is also important too. You need to nail your use of funds. Okay, so when you're going out and seeking capital, whether it's $2 million or $10 million, you better know exactly what every dollar is used for. I usually tell entrepreneurs, don't make it a round number either, like $5 million or $10 million. Make it like 9.7 million. Make it look like you've really put pencil to paper and mapped out every single thing that you plan to use this money. We're using this much for marketing, this much for development, this much for operations, this much for blah, blah, blah. Make that very detailed. And so the only thing you know for sure when you get to that discussion about valuation with a VC, the one thing that you know really, really well is your use of funds. I know this is what I need to get us to the next big milestone. The next big milestone is the product release in a bigger market or a different market. So this is the money that we need to get from point A to point B. It's very detailed. You know exactly what it's for, and then let the investor speak first. It's the the rule one of negotiation. He or she who speaks first loses. So tell them what you need. Let them back into the dilution. Most Series A dilutions are somewhere in the 15 to 30% range, roughly. Yeah, which is exactly in that range we got to.
Yeah. You mentioned something that I hadn't thought about bringing up as a topic, but you mentioned Bo. How important is it for entrepreneurs to have mentors and an advisory board or advisors, and how should they maybe think about finding and qualifying people who can help them there?
We didn't have that on the list, but I'm glad you brought it up. It's very important. I think it's absolutely critical to have mentors. I had a couple along the way. One was Bo. My other mentor was somebody who I got paired with when we won the GEWKC grant in 2015. One of the things that they helped us do is they paired the CEO with a mentor. I got paired with a gentleman. He might even be here today. Is Mark here today? Is Mark Krass here today? Nope. He said he might come.
He's in another panel.
Yeah. He was a retired corporate attorney from Procter & Gamble. I first looked at his LinkedIn profile and I thought, well, how in the world is this gentleman going to be helpful to me, an entrepreneur that's trying to scale this venture-backed business? He turned out to be one of my better friends. He's like a father figure to me. We met regularly. He gave me wonderful advice. So have an open mind about mentors. Bo was very, very helpful in different ways. He had been there, done that with a number of successful startups on his own. But mentors and business coaches, I think, are invaluable. You need a safe space to be able to share frustrations that you may not want to share with co-founders even sometimes, employees, maybe your spouse. You need to be able to speak freely without judgment. It shouldn't be somebody that's invested in the company. It should be somebody that has no skin in the game. I was very fortunate to have a number of people along my journey as an entrepreneur that were willing to help with basically no expectation of any compensation, maybe a lunch here or there. And I think that's why Keith and I are here today. We got actually they're going to pay for our parking. That's the fringe benefit we got today. Free parking.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, see? Now so, this is part of, I was helped by a number of people along the way. I'm trying to give back a little bit in things like this. I know that Keith feels the same way too. So yes, seek out somebody that can have your back and help you think through different problems.
I think that's a really smart approach. And something you said really, I want to amplify a little bit. The idea of having somebody who's been through it and that you can have a conversation with when things aren't going well, because newsflash, things are going to go sideways. Things are not going to go well most of the time. You're a lot of time fighting headwinds and trying to figure out how you're going to solve the next big problem. It's frustrating, it's draining, it's an emotional roller coaster. You've got to have somebody that you can talk to who is, as Chris said, not invested in the business. Sometimes you don't want to talk to your spouse because you're going to scare the hell out of them. You have to have somebody, personal board of directors, personal set of mentors who represent a safe space where you can really let it go and get good advice. That's, I think, absolutely critical. Speaking of good advice, let's talk about all the good advice I've given you. No, I'm kidding. Let's talk about service providers because that also has a pretty big effect on how you are able to raise capital. And sometimes entrepreneurs will know that they need legal advice but not take it. They will go out, try to raise money on a convertible note or a safe, but they downloaded it from a website and they're not getting any advice from a lawyer. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm sorry if there's any attorneys in the room. They are a necessary expense. I hate to say it, and I hated every single time I had to write the check to the attorney. And there were some big ones. The first time we attempted to sell Bloom, we racked up $515,000 in attorney's fees over 6 months. So
how many?
$515,000. By the way, to the firm that you introduced me to. It's true.
I did not get a commission or a cut. I can tell you that.
But unfortunately, it is a necessary evil. We chose to use literally, thanks to Keith's introduction, Cooley was our law firm. They're top 2 in the M&A, I think, tech founder space, at least at the time in the country, and we chose to go with an intentionally higher priced brand name law firm because I think it gave this small Kansas company a little bit of cred, when we were talking to VCs and they would, at some point want to know who was representing us. And when I would share the name Cooley, it instantly sent a message that, we didn't use the local guy here in town that on the weekends bails out people from jail. And then on Monday through Friday, drafts wills and trusts and term sheets. We just kind of had to bite the bullet. Both of our rounds of funding cost us about $50,000. In legal expenses both times, but I knew at the end of the day all of our documents were rock solid, tight, no issues, very, very well scrutinized. Speaking of which, that's another thing on my list here is screwy term sheets. If you end up heading down the path to raise venture capital, do not get sucked into screwy term sheets. Sometimes certain angels or we'll say non-professional VC investors want to put a bunch of crappy investor-friendly terms in those term sheets. The best way to do that is just use a reputable investor. Number one, I think nvca.com. I think they have standardized term sheets. Again, as you're learning this, which you should, as I talked about before, you'll learn what the terms are. Just make sure they're using typical standard term sheets. Also very good advice. There's a standard way to do this and there's a way not to do it. And if you take bad terms from an investor in an early round of financing, that bad term will come back to haunt you in subsequent rounds of financing. In fact, if you, for example, I don't know how steeped in this stuff everybody is, but if you give up a higher liquidation preference than is standard, then your next round of financing, that investor is going to demand the same treatment. That's a bad spot to be in. Mm-hmm. So you definitely want to have legal representation who can sort of beat back any kind of crappy terms and make sure that you're right down the middle
of the market. Chris didn't mention it, but he raised capital from one of the premier fintech VCs in the world. This is not on the list, but I'm going to make you answer it anyway. One of the premier fintech VCs in the world in QED, and you raised capital from Commerce Ventures. I mean, these are real deal fintech VCs. And so he has an amazing set of experiences working with great investors and having a board with great investors. Now, I don't know how to frame this question exactly, so you're not, well, I'll just give it a shot. So you no doubt also had experience with bad investors. I'm curious, can you talk everybody through the experience and what is a good investor versus what is a bad investor once they're actually on the cap table? Because just remember, once the wire lands, they're on your cap table, and it's either good or it's bad. And if it's going to be good, it's going to be great. And if it's going to be bad, it could be really bad.
Yeah, and again,
you don't have to give names.
Well, I was just thinking I probably shouldn't. Yeah, and the cap table, if you don't know what a cap table means, again, that's on your list of things to figure out if you raise capital. We overall were very fortunate that we had great investors. We had a combination on our cap table of professional VCs like QED, Commerce, Industry Ventures, a handful of well-known investors, especially QED in the fintech space. We had strategic investors, which are corporations that use portions of their balance sheet to make strategic investments in companies that they might potentially be interested in down the road of acquiring, or maybe a commercial partnership with. And we had high net worth investors on our cap table. If at all possible, you want to, if you can, start with the professional venture investors. I feel like they have the process dialed in. One of the other lessons I learned after a while that you can write down and not have to relearn on your own, you should always be looking to find your lead investor first. If you find out that the investor you're talking to is not typically a lead investor, and what I mean by a lead investor is that it's the investor that probably writes the biggest check in the round. They are the ones that negotiate pricing, valuation with you in that term sheet, and they also are the firm that should be doing 99% of the due diligence. Another side lesson here is don't allow, if you have 3 or 4 different investors that will be investing in your round, they should not all be doing due diligence. Usually one firm, the lead firm, leads due diligence. If you had 4 or 5 different firms trying to run due diligence with you, you would literally never get anything done. It's an arduous process that needs to be led by one firm. So my point in sharing that is we had a combination of different investors. You find your lead investor first, and in my experience, just over 2 rounds, certainly there are people that have raised more money and over many more rounds, but what I learned over those 2 rounds is once we found our lead investor, it became infinitely easier to find the follow-on subsequent investors because the round is priced, they know what the valuation is. If it's a well-known VC, anybody else that joins should feel comfortable that a professional is leading the process of negotiating the term sheet and running the due diligence process. I would say overall we were lucky in that our investors were generally good. QED was absolutely the been there, done that. They were very, very consultative with us. They would dispatch, people from their home VC headquarters, their lair, to our office for days at a time on a consulting type arrangement, which was very helpful. We had high net worth investors here in the greater Kansas City area, some of which were great. They wrote the checks, they were supportive, they were our cheerleaders, they really didn't get involved too much. Our strategic investors, we had some brand name investors. I'm talking like Prudential, Nationwide, Allianz, some really big financial companies that made strategic investments in Bloom. Unfortunately, we were not able to get much going with them. That's another nugget of advice that I have for you. If you are talking to a strategic, a corporate investor, really dig into how they can help you beyond the check. Okay, I mean, in a number of cases, corporations, if you've got a startup, there's some big companies out there, you've thought it already. You're like, man, if we could just get a partnership with Target or somebody else, what if Target invested in you? Great. But then also, what's the plan to commercialize or help commercialize your product? So if you're talking to a strategic, make sure that they can get very detailed besides writing the check, how could they help your company within their company? Oftentimes, high net worth investors, the best thing they can do is just invest and be a cheerleader, occasionally make some intros. And that's the way most of our investors were. Fortunately, we did have one. Can I share the story without naming the name about the term sheet that got dropped?
I think you should, yeah.
So just
this is the real stuff that happens.
Yeah, beware of this. So our second round, we were attempting to raise $15 million, and I found a lead investor, family office here in Kansas City. I'll leave the name out. Everybody in the room would know this name. Signed a term sheet with us to raise $15 million. They were going to write the biggest check in that round. I knew this was in August. I knew that by early November, our runway was going to zero, meaning on November 5th, I would not be able to write any payroll checks to any employees. We had 25 employees at the time, which is why we were raising the capital. On September 15th, I got a call from that investor after the term sheet had been signed for over a month at that time, and 45 days from when we would run out of money, that investor called and said, we're backing out of the deal. So 45 days from not being able to make payroll to 25 people, and that's kind of what I said earlier. It's not a done deal until the money is in the bank, and just know that is a risk. Luckily, it has a happy ending to the story. We were able to raise the round, and everybody got paid. No paychecks were missed, luckily.
I think that actually happens not infrequently. You had a favorable outcome in that case, Chris. You have to know that venture investors are fickle. Are there any venture investors in the room? No, I can say it. I don't care. Venture investors are fickle. They're just like anybody else. They're people. If something scares them, they may run for the hills. And then you're going to be left holding the bag trying to figure out, how do I make payroll? And so I would advise always making sure that you have a pretty strong syndicate when you're building the next round, and making sure that you have investors that you can count on, because sometimes rounds fall apart, and you have to make sure that you've got people in your corner who are going to be able to help you with checks in an emergency when things are going sideways because an investor pulled out. This kind of stuff happens all the time. I hear that story over and over again. We at Novel, we see companies, we probably see 3 or 4 a month that are in the middle of that exact same situation. I had an investor, something happened, they pulled out, my fundamentals are good, they freaked out and left. What am I going to do? And it's a tough spot.
How much time do we have? We have another 10 minutes?
2:30?
2:30, yep.
Okay. Well, I was going to take a couple minutes to talk about pitch deck tips too. Obviously, if you're here interested in raising capital, then you're obviously going to have to build a pitch deck. So I've got a couple bullet point thoughts and tips here. There's no one right way to do this. So again, this is my advice. I know that there's other theories out there. This worked well for me though, what I'm about to share. So I think personal stories in your pitch can be very effective if used correctly. So what's that? About my sister? So the personal story we used for Bloom was, as I told you earlier, Bloom was an online digital 401k, online digital financial advisor, specifically for people that work at a company and have a 401k and didn't have any idea what they're supposed to be doing with this 401k. So when we were building the app, I asked my younger sister Annie if I could get her login credentials to her 401k so we could test out Bloom on her 401k. And we get logged in to her account, and I see that she has every penny of her life savings in her retirement account sitting in the money market fund, which means it wasn't invested. And keep in mind, I'm a financial advisor. My other brother is a financial advisor too, so she didn't have to go far to get advice. And I call her up on the phone, and I'm like, Annie, what happened? Did you just bail out of all your investments? Something scary out of the market? And she said, no. I remember when we signed up, or I signed up for this 5 or 6 years ago, I remember they gave me a bunch of information, and I was like, well, one of these days I was going to call you and ask for help, but one of these days turned into 5 or 6 years. she's busy chasing my nephews around the house, things of that nature, and it just got put off to the side. Well, she missed 5 or 6 years post-financial crisis of massive growth in the stock market. And I always would continue this personal story by telling, making sure I let everybody know that my sister was very, very smart. She was valedictorian of a big high school class. And my point is that, screwing up your 401k does not discriminate anybody who's capable of doing this. And so I think in that case, by sharing a very relatable story, I usually follow it up and tell the investor, I'm like, I'm sure your 401k is fine. You know what you're doing. In their mind, they're like, I don't know what I'm doing with it either. I need to sign up for Bloom at this point too. So I think personal stories can be effective. I don't know that you want them to be real tear jerkers necessarily, but we all are humans. Don't ever forget the person across the desk or the Zoom or the phone from you. Even though they sit in an ivory VC tower, they are still a human. They feel things like we all feel things, and so I think personal stories can be effective. In the deck, by the second page, if I, as the investor, cannot tell exactly immediately what it is you're building or the problem that you're solving, you've waited too long. It can't take 2 or 3 pages. It's got to come out very clearly. I think decks should be in the 10 to 15 pages. When I was pitching, and again, I had 130 pitches, what I would do is I actually would build 2 versions of my deck. The first version was a deck that I would use if I was live, like in a conference room, or doing a Zoom with them where I was screen sharing. And that the version that I would share as I'm presenting was very much like Steve Jobs used to present. He would have one picture on the screen, and that is it, no text, or one word, if anything. You don't want the attention not on you. So the slide should be super clean for presenting. Resist temptation to fill it up with a bunch of copy. Use images that go along with what you're going to explain to them. You need a second version of that deck. So at the end of that presentation, if the investor you've just pitched says, hey, can you send me a copy of that deck? You then need to send them a version of that deck that can stand on its own 2 feet. So that maybe needs to have some word and copy in there because they might share that with their partners, so it can't be only pictures. I found that to be very effective for us, and it felt like when I was pitching and presenting, I did have eyes paying attention to what I was saying, not trying to decipher some graph or TAM size or anything else. Anything else you'd add to pitch decks?
You touched on something that I think is a really important lesson. You have to remember that at the end of the day, it's the relationship that triggers the decision. The economics can be interesting, the financial opportunity can be compelling, but you are in the middle of a trust-building exercise when you are out raising capital. And so you have to be very aware of how you are building relationships with investors, because without trust and without a solid relationship, there will be no wire, there will be no decision to invest. That's part of the sales process, but I think it's absolutely critical. The numbers are important, the pitch deck is important, but like Chris said, we're all human beings, and at the end of the day, you're trying to get one human being to make a decision in your favor, and that is all about sales and emotional connection.
Especially with raising capital in an early stage company, most oftentimes the investors are investing in you. I mean, clearly you need to have a good idea and a product, but really at this stage, they're buying you. So keep that in mind. You may be really focused on explaining the problem that you're solving or the product that you're building, but like Keith said, every signal you're giving, body language, confidence, relationship building, asking a lot of questions. That's another takeaway. Just ask a lot of questions. What was that famous book? How to Win Friends and Influence People? Yeah, Dale Carnegie, the whole book, I can tell you what the book said. Ask people questions. People love talking about themselves. I love when I'm doing this right now. I've had an hour up here to talk about myself and what I've done. This has been fun for me. If you can flip the script and get the person you're sitting across the table or the phone from to talk about themselves and their lives, you may find that after an hour, they've talked for 59 minutes. They don't know anything about you, but I guarantee you when they hang up the phone, they're like, gosh, I really like that person.
That was a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, it's really, I want to hear more. Maybe the one final concluding bit of advice we can certainly do some Q&A. One of the things that I like to tell entrepreneurs is to stay too small to fail. So who remembers the term too big to fail from the financial crisis, 08 and 09? We all heard that over and over and over about the big banks on Wall Street. So I like to tell entrepreneurs to stay too small to fail. Okay, so what I mean by that is keeping your company lean for as long as possible. Even if you raise capital, don't go out and blow it like the Uber guys did on huge parties, or the WeWork people blowing it on huge parties and jets and things like that. Keep your powder dry as much as possible. And if you don't raise capital, stay lean, stay small. Delay the gratitude, delay the big fun celebrations, because the longer you can stay small, the longer your runway is. Again, and that, whether you're building a revenue-backed business where you're not raising capital or you're raising funding, the more time you can give yourself, the better chance of success. Like, what if you just hung on a little bit longer? The analogy I used to give is, imagine that we were gold prospectors and we loaded up the family wagon in the 1800s. And we headed across the country to California to prospect for gold, but I told my wife and daughters, I said, we've only got enough food and rations for 6 months, so we better strike gold in 6 months or we're going to turn around and head back home. Well, what if you had 8 months or a year? Maybe we would have hit gold in month 7 or 8. So just buy yourself time, and the way you do that is by staying small for as long as possible.
All right. Let's do some Q&A. Oh, good. So my nightmare was I was going to say Q&A, and everybody was just going to stare at me.
It's always a risk.
Yeah,
It's always a risk.
Well, I'm a risk taker. All right, you've got a question.
Yes. Everything that you said about VC seems to be true for angel investors too. Is that not true? Am I getting wrong? Because it does apply almost exactly to the point of raising funds to angel investors.
So I just want to make sure I heard your question correctly. Is your question, is it in fact true that everything that we've talked about so far is applicable also to angel investors?
Yeah, I think that's totally true. Yeah, the only caveat I would add is that I did run across a few angel investors who one of the things that maybe left a little bad taste in my mouth was the angel investor that says, "What, are you profitable?" And I always kind of thought that was the wrong question to ask at the stage we were raising capital. And it also, I kind of think that person maybe had just experience investing in brick and mortar established companies. We were building basically a SaaS company. Very few of them, is Tesla even profitable at this point? I think finally now. I mean, it took them years and years. But so I thought you just have to be careful when talking to angel investors that they, again, I'd be asking them questions, grilling them about what investments they've made in companies similar to yours. What's their background? Did they come from a manufacturing, were they an owner of a manufacturing company? And it's totally different than a SaaS business. One of the things as a founder that's out raising capital, if you are out raising capital, you're not at home or at the office working on your business. And so I'm all about not wasting time. And the other thing I didn't mention is when you're talking to an angel or even an experienced investor, trying to get to a point as quickly as possible to determine if they're worth your time to keep talking to. One of the things I mentioned earlier is find a lead investor first. Took me a while to learn that. I got to a point where in our second round, my first phone calls, I would say, do you generally lead in rounds of this size, Series B rounds? If they said no, I would literally tell them, thank you, I will keep you in mind. When we find a lead investor, I'll give you a call back. Then I was off the phone and on to the next.
Yeah, I sort of on the same note. Well, the very quick answer to that question is don't be any angel investor's first investment. Just don't. Because you don't know how that person's going to react when things start to go sideways. And like I said before, things do go sideways. So you want to make sure that if you're going to have an angel investor on your cap table, they are acquainted with the roller coaster that is startup life and startup investing. One of the things that you reminded me of is when we raise capital, we've raised capital from angels, from VCs. We actually, when we are in the fundraising meeting, the first thing that we do is sort of force them to qualify themselves. I have 8 or 9 questions that I ask them. Before I even tell them anything about me or about Novel, I'm boom, 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 qualify yourself for me. And then I'm not quite as brutal as Chris. I don't get off the phone, but I end it pretty quick if it's clear that they're not going to be a good fit for us. Because, again, like Chris said, every minute that I spend with an investor who's never going to help is a minute that I've just wasted. So
By the way, that's awesome that you do that. And why can't all of you do the exact
should.
same thing? It took Keith and I, to be the age we are in several rounds of doing it why can't you start the first time you raise capital and do it that way?
I think it conveys sophistication.
So
and
much
seriousness.
confidence.
I love it when entrepreneurs qualify me.
Yes,
Force me to show you that you should be talking to me.
correct. And instantly you're more attracted to that person.
Absolutely.
Hi. I was asked about, because you were mimicking, Steve Jobs' presentations. What action did you take from his presentation to implement into your own life? What worked well for you, or what did you actually critique in your own?
So there is a book, I think it's called The Presenting Secrets of Steve Jobs, that I studied before my first ever pitch. And learned how he did, but a lot of it was around how he presents images too. If you remember back to some of those iPhone releases, it would just be a beautiful picture of the iPhone or the iPad or what he was talking about, and he was telling a story as that visual was coming up. I think it's a lot about that, and it's a lot about kind of building to some excitement. And do you remember how he'd also say, "Oh, and there's one more thing"? Do you remember that? I try to do a little bit of that occasionally too.
And I take a little bit of a different approach. I don't like to pitch. I can, and you can wind me up and I'll go out and I'll do the thing. But I like to try to turn the tables as much as possible and make the investor see that I'm the one with the opportunity. Yeah, you've got capital, and that's awesome. God knows I need your capital. But I'm the one with the opportunity. I'm the one working my ass off. So I qualify you. I walk you through the slides. But pitching, not a fan. Mm-hmm. Not a fan. I think what that does is, and everybody in the room will probably agree with me, unless you're a VC, in which case you won't. But it creates this weird power and information imbalance, right? Like I need to get up and dance for the money. I don't think so, right? So I always. When we have VC firms who are like, hey, we're going to have you on, we're going to do a Zoom and you can pitch, I make it very clear, like, actually, I'm not going to pitch. I'm going to send you the deck and you're going to go through it. And then I'm going to answer your questions. But I'm not going to go slide by slide and walk you through the opportunity. It's just, I'm not going to do that. I don't know if I'm good at it anyway. But I take a totally different approach. And I think that's something that entrepreneurs can think about is what is the approach that really resonates with who you are and what you're trying to build. Chris is really good at it. I've seen him do it. It's great. I'm probably not very good at it. You can tell I might be a little bit combative. So, so I like to do it my own way. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think that's all along this journey. You really have to align what you're doing with who you are and what you're trying to accomplish. And sometimes the norm just isn't the right answer.
Well, I'm going to challenge you. Are you sure that you want to raise venture capital after hearing what we said earlier tonight?
Well, I have instructions on them, but we're building the software part, so it's like, yeah, I'm bootstrapped on the ground, like,
Mm-hmm. Well, I would just, run out the options of could you do it, without having to raise capital. But if you did, then I would encourage you to start searching for investors that have a history of investing in your space. And Google searches can help you find that. And then try and see if you're in any way, shape, or form connected to somebody in that space that can provide that first jumping off intro. And once you get that first intro, then you can kind of worm your way around the space by asking for referrals as you're talking to folks.
This is a segue to what you say. What are maybe like 3 things when you get that yes for the venture? What are 3 things to know that they're in fact or maybe not for you?
That they're not for you? Well, first of all, one of the things that came to mind is a yes isn't always a yes. We talked about that too. We're 100% in doesn't even mean they're 100% in. One thing we didn't mention is calling referrals. So you get a yes, and that should be on your list of questions, the ability to call other founder CEOs that they've invested in. Both maybe even an example of one that they're currently working with, and maybe one in the past. And that might be a good way to further vet things out. Again, you're also sending that psychological message again. I'm checking you out. Thank you for saying yes, but I haven't agreed to your yes yet until I check out some references. Other signs are, I mentioned earlier the lead investor in a round should be the one doing the due diligence. If you've got a non-lead investor who's dominating your time with requests, that could be an early bad sign of more things to come, because if they're asking all these questions and dominating your time before they've written the check, imagine what they might look like after they've written the check.
On the point of sort of doing diligence on the investor, they're always going to tell you who you should call. Like, oh, talk to Chris. He's a CEO in our portfolio. The undercurrent there is he knows Chris loves him, right?
Yes.
So he's going to get a good review. Definitely call founders that they don't recommend that you talk to. Do a little bit of back channel work. You
can figure that out, because all the VCs on their website have a list of all the companies they've invested in. You can pick up a phone and find your way to the founder.
And people will always talk about their investors.
Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask the opposite of that question. So once you get a yes for your lead investor, what are the first three things that you should do at that point?
First is high five.
High five. So I'm assuming the term sheet has been signed and agreed to. Is that what stage are we at here?
Yeah, let's say that you've got a term sheet and you've signed it. You're happy with the terms.
You've agreed to the valuation. You've agreed to the terms. You've signed the term sheet. Basically, then get ready for full lobotomy exams, full rectal exams, if I can say that, like deep dives into everything that you've ever written down in a file ever. Especially if it's a publicly traded company that is either investing or looking to acquire you. You're going to keep very good records. Keep very, very good records. There's no excuse these days. Everything can be kept digitally and backed up, so that's a no-brainer.
I can keep going with questions.
So I did a pre-seed raise and then the seed. Can you talk about some of your early give-up control when you created a board control versus an advisory board, and what you had to give up in each round?
Give me an answer.
Yeah, I'll answer for Novel, and then you can walk them through Bloom. So we've raised $15.5 million of venture capital over 3 rounds of financing. We did not say okay to having a board until our most recent round of financing, and it's just 3 people. It's me, my co-founder, and one of the lead investors. We were super careful about making sure that we did not give up more ownership than we wanted to, and control. Control was actually the most important thing to us. So we were very purposeful in the first couple of rounds about you can be an advisor and we'll have quarterly calls with you, but you have no governance and no influence in the business at all. And then when we brought on some additional investors earlier this year, we just couldn't hold out anymore. They were like, you got to have a board, guys. You're just like a couple of dudes making decisions. So we ended up, now we've got, like I said, a 3-person board. But that's, I think, the natural progression, right? You're going to have an advisory board first, and then eventually you're going to take on enough institutional capital that they sort of say, you have to have a board now.
Yeah, and we can continue. Maybe I think the next session's coming in. So you want to stick around up here and do a few more questions?